U.S. President Joe Biden holds talks with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Biden leaves for London this morning. The CBC's Dominic Velitis is following this story for us, and he joins us now from London. Dom, what more can you tell us about Biden's visit to Europe?
Well, I can tell you, Farah, that Joe Biden has now just boarded Air Force One. When he gets to the UK later today, his first official stop will be tomorrow. It'll be 10 Downing Street for a meeting with Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, their fifth meeting in as many months. It will be a fairly low-key meeting. No big announcements are expected, nor will there be any big joint press conference to cap it all off. Topping the agenda of those talks, though, will be the war in Ukraine and Tuesday's big NATO summit in Lithuania. After that, Farah, will be the highlight of Biden's brief stay here in the UK with a visit to Windsor Castle to meet King Charles. This will be Biden's first meeting with him since the coronation in May. The two heads of state, we're told, are expected to discuss climate issues, which is a subject Charles has campaigned about for more than 5 decades. After that, it's off to the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, where NATO leaders will gather for a key summit. And divisions over Ukraine's membership bid, Sweden's accession to the alliance, and boosting ammunition stockpiles are just some of the topics that are set to be discussed there. Biden will then visit Finland for a US Nordic Leaders Summit before flying home to the US on Thursday. Farah.
All right, lots to discuss. We know that Britain is one of the signatories to a convention that's calling for a ban on the production of cluster bombs, and so is Canada. How could we see this issue play out during Biden's visit?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be in the background of the various meetings that Joe Biden will be attending over the next few days, not least of all because yesterday Rishi Sunak publicly refused to back the White House's decision to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, pointing out to reporters that the UK is one of more than 100 countries that have actually banned them. Germany, Spain and, of course, Canada have also expressed their concerns about the White House's move. So the issue will be in the background when Biden and Sunak meet tomorrow. I think it'll also be in the background when that NATO summit gets away in Vilnius on Tuesday. It is, Farah, a bit of pill for quite a few US allies to swallow, especially those that have signed up to the 2008 Oslo Convention, which bans the production, storage, sale and use of cluster munitions. The White House, though, obviously thinks the ends justifies the means, that Ukraine is running low on conventional artillery shells and that these cluster munitions will provide a kind of stopgap until the US can ramp up production. Farah.
All right, thanks very much, Dom. That is the CBC's Dominic Velitis in London. For more on the NATO summit, we are joined by Judy Dempsey. She's a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of the Strategic Europe blog. She joins us now from Berlin. Good morning, Judy.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
How do you think cluster munition is going to affect conversations at the summit this week?
Well, it's one of many issues, but the cluster munitions issue is highly sensitive. Given the whole track of the First World War, Second World War, how Germany sees it. And it's quite a divisive issue. And as your correspondent in London pointed out, there are actually quite divisions. As far as I'm aware, I think about 21 or 22 of the NATO countries actually have signed up to this convention on cluster munitions. And those who haven't signed it, actually it includes the United States, but of course Russia and Ukraine as well. It's divisive. Actually, there's a subset to all this story. Why does Ukraine want these cluster bomb munitions? The real answer is that both the Europeans and the West and the Americans and Canadians were not delivering enough munitions, conventional weapons to Ukraine. And this is a kind of last resort in some ways. And if you look at all the reports coming out, deliveries have slowed down. And the Ukrainians, if they want to win this war, they need desperately more military assistance. So this actually complements the reason why Ukraine is seeking the cluster bombs.
Certainly that's going to be a topic at the summit this week. And Judy, we're now 500 plus days into the war on Ukraine. What's at stake at the NATO summit in terms of support for Ukraine? What's
at stake? It depends on where you're sitting. there was a big issue around all the tables for the last couple of months in preparation for this summit in Vilnius, and whether Ukraine should be offered immediate membership, even though it's at war, or the promise of membership, NATO membership, once the war is over. And so this is, frankly, this is an incredibly difficult decision. If Ukraine was offered NATO membership now in a war, would NATO come to defend Europe? And this would play into President Putin's hands. If Ukraine was offered NATO membership after the war, well, then President Putin could continue the war and beat as much as possible Ukraine to submission. And it's a very, very difficult issue. That's one side of the argument. The other side, of course, is what kind of security guarantees the NATO member states can give Ukraine. We promised security guarantees in 1994 in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. And of course, these guarantees were not fulfilled. So there's an awful lot to play here. There are divisions in the alliance. The Baltic states and Central Europeans are really determined to have a firm timetable, firm commitment for Ukraine. The other member states are, but it depends on the timetable.
Mm-hmm. And we know that obviously membership is going to be one of the difficult issues that's going to be talked about. But what about security commitments? I imagine that will be something that will be discussed during this two-day summit in detail amongst the allied countries.
Security commitments are very complex. And when you break it down, it's about coalitions of the willing. Which countries, whether they're members of NATO or not members of NATO, are actually going to provide serious security guarantees to Ukraine? And what does the guarantee mean? Will it be implemented during war or after war? To be fair to the West, I mean, they've given a huge amount of ammunition and military support to Ukraine, but what Ukraine is seeking now is security guarantees. And the definition of this is really still open to interpretation. And some people have argued, some experts have argued, oh, well, we can do it on a comparison with Israel's security guarantees from both Germany and the United States. That won't work because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is non-ending. And Ukraine doesn't want a non-ending war. It wants serious, committed security guarantees and no going back to the past.
Now, Judy, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you, before the war in Ukraine, NATO was sort of starting to be seen as old and stale, somewhat of a Cold War relic. French President Emmanuel Macron famously called the alliance, quote, brain dead in 2019. How has the conflict with Russia reshaped NATO and its objectives?
Fundamentally, actually, NATO, having left Afghanistan and withdrawn from its various missions abroad, it's come back to Europe. It's what a strange situation. It's now back to the Cold War situation, and it's now focusing on the Arctic. It's focusing on Central Europe, and it's focusing on the Black Sea area as well. This is so interesting how NATO sees a kind of return to a serious. It is, in fact, in some ways an ideological but political military conflict with Russia. And this is going to actually underpin the whole nature of the summit, how this is a European war and how NATO is going to defend Europe with Canada, especially with the United States, and how we actually going to deal, as you mentioned, with Russia. This is the big question.
So much to unpack in those 2 days, Judy. We appreciate you sharing your time with us to tell us some of your expertise. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Judy Dempsey is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe. She joined us this morning from Berlin.